On July 4th, 1776, 13 American colonies declared independence from the British Empire and immediately found themselves $35 million in debt. The Revolutionary War had been financed through loans from France, Spain, and the Netherlands, along with bonds sold to American citizens who believed in the cause of independence. Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, stood before Congress in 1790 and made a radical proposal. The federal government should assume all state debts and pay them in full. His argument was simple but powerful. Credit is the lifeblood of a nation, and America needed to establish itself as a borrower who always repays. Hamilton's plan worked spectacularly. By honoring its debts, the United States built a reputation for financial reliability that would serve it for centuries. Throughout the 1800s, America borrowed to finance westward expansion, build canals and railroads, and fight the Civil War, but it also paid down its debts during peacetime. By 1835, under President Andrew Jackson, the United States achieved something that has never been repeated. It paid off the entire national debt completely. The federal government owed nothing to anyone. This debt-free status lasted exactly 1 year before new borrowing began, but it demonstrated that America understood fiscal responsibility. Fast forward to 1945. World War II had just ended, and the United States emerged as the undisputed superpower of the world. The war had been extraordinarily expensive, pushing the national debt to 119% of GDP, the highest ratio in American history. But the economy was strong, industrial production was booming, and over the next 3 decades, America paid down that debt through economic growth and disciplined budgets. By the mid-1970s, the debt-to-GDP ratio had fallen to 35%, and the United States was the wealthiest, most productive nation on earth. American manufacturing dominated global markets. The dollar was backed by gold and served as the world's reserve currency. American workers enjoyed rising wages, affordable housing, and generous pensions. The government invested heavily in infrastructure, building the interstate highway system, funding scientific research, and sending astronauts to the moon. This was the golden age of American economic power, when debt was used strategically for productive investments that generated returns for decades. Then, something fundamental changed. In 1971, President Richard Nixon ended the gold standard, severing the link between the dollar and physical gold reserves. This decision gave the government unlimited ability to print money and borrow without the constraint of gold backing. What followed was a slow-motion transformation of American fiscal policy from disciplined investment to reckless spending. The 1,980 seconds marked the beginning of the debt explosion. President Ronald Reagan promised to reduce government spending while cutting taxes and increasing military expenditures. The result was predictable. The national debt tripled from $1 trillion in 1981 to $3 trillion by 1989. Reagan's theory, supply-side economics, argued that tax cuts would generate so much economic growth that revenues would increase and pay for themselves. This did not happen. Instead, America discovered that it could borrow cheaply because the world trusted the dollar, and politicians discovered that voters rewarded spending and tax cuts but punished spending cuts and tax increases. The political incentives had fundamentally shifted toward permanent deficits. The 1,990 seconds briefly interrupted this trend. The Cold War ended, allowing defense spending cuts, and a technology boom generated strong tax revenues. President Bill Clinton worked with Congress to pass budget deals that actually produced surpluses from 1998 to 2001, the last time America would run a balanced budget. The Congressional Budget Office projected that the entire national debt could be paid off by 2010 if the surpluses continued. This projection now seems almost comically optimistic. What happened instead was a series of decisions and crises that sent American debt into the stratosphere. The September 11th attacks in 2001 triggered 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq that would cost over $2 trillion. President George W. Bush cut taxes while simultaneously fighting these wars, an unprecedented decision to wage major military conflicts without raising revenue to pay for them. The 2008 financial crisis then forced the government to bail out banks, rescue the auto industry, and stimulate the collapsing economy, adding trillions more to the debt. President Barack Obama inherited an economy in freefall and responded with massive stimulus spending that prevented a depression but added $10 trillion to the debt over 8 years. President Donald Trump added another $8 trillion through tax cuts, increased military spending, and COVID-19 relief packages. President Joe Biden added trillions more through infrastructure spending, student loan forgiveness attempts, and pandemic recovery programs. By 2025, the United States national debt exceeds $36 trillion, larger than the entire American economy, larger than the economies of China, Japan, and Germany combined. America now holds the distinction of being the most indebted nation in human history. not just in absolute terms, but approaching record levels relative to economic output. The question that nobody in Washington wants to answer is simple. How did we get here? And more importantly, what happens when the bill comes due? To understand how America became the most indebted country in history, you need to understand the addiction that consumed Washington over the past 40 years. The addiction to cheap money. For decades, the United States has been able to borrow at extraordinarily low interest rates because the dollar serves as the world's reserve currency. When other countries need to conduct international trade, they do it in dollars. When foreign governments want to store their wealth safely, they buy U.S. Treasury bonds. This created a seemingly magical situation where America could borrow trillions of dollars at interest rates below the rate of inflation, meaning the real cost of borrowing was effectively zero or even negative. Politicians of both parties realized they could spend unlimited amounts of money, promise everything to everyone, and face no immediate consequences. Want to cut taxes? Borrow the difference. Want to increase military spending? Borrow more. Want to expand health care? Add it to the debt. Want to send stimulus checks to voters? Print the money and worry about it later. This worked beautifully until it stopped working. The mechanics of how America finances its debt are important to understand. The Treasury Department issues bonds with various maturity dates: short-term bills, medium-term notes, and long-term bonds. Investors, both domestic and foreign, buy these bonds as safe investments. The largest foreign holders are Japan and China, each owning over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. Domestic holders include the Federal Reserve, pension funds, insurance companies, and individual investors. As long as investors believe they will be repaid with interest, they continue buying bonds, allowing the government to roll over old debt by issuing new debt. The system functions like a person who pays off one credit card by taking out another credit card, except on a scale of trillions of dollars. This Ponzi-like structure only works if confidence remains high. The moment investors doubt America's ability or willingness to repay, interest rates spike, making new borrowing prohibitively expensive, which triggers a debt spiral. Here is where we are today. The United States now spends over $1 trillion per year just on interest payments, more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any other government program, except Social Security. This interest cost is growing exponentially because of two factors. The size of the debt keeps increasing, and interest rates have risen from near zero to over 4%. Every time the Treasury refinances maturing bonds, it must now pay these higher rates, permanently increasing the annual interest burden. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2030, interest costs will exceed $1.5 trillion annually, and by 2050, interest will consume more than half of all federal tax revenue. At that point, the government faces an impossible choice: default on the debt, slash all other spending, including Social Security and Medicare, or raise taxes to confiscatory levels that destroy economic growth. None of these options are politically viable, which means the most likely outcome is continued borrowing until a crisis forces action. But the debt crisis is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It represents a fundamental betrayal of future generations. Every dollar borrowed today is a dollar that tomorrow's workers must repay with interest. America has effectively stolen from its children and grandchildren to fund consumption today. The government has spent trillions on wars that accomplished nothing: bailouts for Wall Street banks, subsidies for corporations, and entitlement programs that were never properly funded. Meanwhile, productive investments that would generate future returns, infrastructure, education, scientific research, have been neglected. The country is borrowing to consume rather than to invest, which is the definition of unsustainable debt. Several factors have accelerated this crisis in recent years. The COVID-19 pandemic prompted the government to spend over $5 trillion on relief programs, much of it necessary, but much of it poorly targeted and fraudulent. The Federal Reserve printed trillions of dollars to buy government bonds, artificially suppressing interest rates and enabling even more borrowing. This money printing contributed to the highest inflation in 40 years, which eroded the value of savings and wages while increasing the cost of everything. Now the Fed has been forced to raise interest rates to fight inflation, which makes the debt more expensive to service. America is caught in a trap of its own making. The structural drivers of debt are locked in place. Social Security and Medicare face demographic time bombs as baby boomers retire, requiring tens of trillions in additional spending over coming decades. Defense spending remains at near record levels despite no major wars. Interest costs grow automatically. Meanwhile, neither political party has any appetite for the difficult choices required to fix the problem. Republicans refuse to raise taxes or cut defense spending. Democrats refuse to cut entitlements or social programs. Both parties collaborated on the 2017 tax cuts and multiple rounds of pandemic spending that added trillions to the debt. The political incentives are completely broken. Politicians who propose fiscal responsibility are punished by voters and replaced by politicians who promise more spending. The most dangerous aspect of this crisis is that America is approaching the point of no return. Economic research suggests that when government debt exceeds 130% of GDP, economic growth slows permanently because resources are diverted from productive investment to debt service. America is now at 124% and rising. Some economists argue we have already crossed the threshold where the debt becomes mathematically impossible to repay through normal means. The only historical examples of countries that have escaped this level of debt without default are cases where they inflated away the debt by printing money until the currency lost most of its value, or cases where they experienced decades of painful austerity and economic stagnation. Neither option is acceptable for a country that considers itself the world's superpower. The most likely scenario is that America continues on its current path until a triggering event, a failed bond auction, a currency crisis, a geopolitical shock, forces a reckoning. At that point, the adjustments will be sudden, severe, and imposed by markets rather than chosen by voters. The American debt crisis is not a future problem. It is happening right now, and every year of delay makes the eventual resolution more painful.